When was it that you learned that the history you had been taught was flawed? Or when you learned a history that correlated better with the facts? Or when was it you learned better, more full facts? When was it that you had to embrace another harder, truer narrative of nation, of family, of self? Well, for me, one of those times happened in divinity school, when I enrolled in a course on the religious traditions of the Southwest with a visiting professor. Visiting professors, of course, are the ones they bring in to say the things they don't want anyone permanently around to say. At least in the school where I attended divinity school. The professor was Inés Talamentes, and she wasn't a revolutionary, but she did tell the truth, and how often it is that telling the truth is revolutionary. As an elder of the Mescalero Apache tribe, Inés Talamentes was the founder of the PhD program in Native American religious traditions at UC Santa Barbara, the first ever, I think. During the course of the semester in which we were talking about the religious traditions of the Southwest, we learned some history, or rather, we relearned it. There's evidence all around us of a growing relearning, right? I mean, more and more often now, it's not unusual to arrive at a conference or gathering and be greeted first by the naming and the honoring of the people on whose land we stand in that moment. People whose land it was before it was declared someone else's, before the pretense of God or nation or divine plan was used as a stand-in for greed, arrogance, and a justifying kind of violent entitlement. And increasingly around this nation, this weekend isn't a time to tip our hat to the hired treasure hunter and explorer Christopher Columbus, but a time we offer ourselves a chance to name and attend to the legacy of genocide that colonialism assumes, as historian Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz unblinkingly pointed out in the reading this morning. Genocide isn't too strong a word, of course, though the word and idea were coined in the wake of World War II to describe the systematic oppression and murder of Jews and others. It maps onto Native communities and how they were dealt with by those who arrived on these shores. Both Benjamin Madley and Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, in their respective tellings of the history of the United States, make the point that the treatment of Native or Indigenous people in North America was genocide. Madley, a professor of history at UCLA, even titles his 2016 book accordingly: An American Genocide, the United States and the California Indian Catastrophe. Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz waits until page 8 of her book, as you heard, to make the point. The UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, for those who don't already know, named any one of 5 acts to be genocide if committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. Those acts included killing members of the group, causing bodily or mental harm to them, deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about their physical destruction, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. The United States is guilty on all counts. Benjamin Madley cites statistics and firsthand accounts that are harrowing. In California alone, he writes that although the native populations were already devastated by previous colonizers, by the time the United States took control and under United States rule from 1846 to 1870, a mere 24 years, the native population in this state plummeted from 150,000 to 30,000. In 1880, only 10 years later, the census recorded only 16,277 native people, a 50% decrease in that time frame alone. You can't even use the word decimate to describe what happened here, because decimate means to kill 1 in 10. And this nation, just in that period alone, left 1 in 10 behind. Disease and starvation were to blame, but not entirely separable, of course, from other conditions, most notably displacement. Added to that were such conditions as forced confinement on reservations, brutal life in missions, conditions so awful that historians compare them not hyperbolically to Nazi concentration camps, conditions so awful that many native people in this state will not even use the word mission, not to describe a neighborhood or a street name, because that word is so foul in its associations. Read the accounts, but don't do so on an empty stomach. Then, too, there were the out-and-out massacres and the casual homicides carried out with little, if any, legal repercussions in a state that had almost no legal controls in place to curb the violence, if it had wanted to, which it isn't clear it did. In 1890, Hubert Howe Bancroft said of the Indian catastrophe under U.S. rule, quote, "The savages were in the way. It was one of the last human hunts of civilization, the basest and most brutal of them all." And in 1935, U.S. Indian Affairs Commission John Collier added, quote, "The world's annals contain few comparable instances of swift depopulation, practically of racial massacre at the hands of a conquering race." The history Inez Talamentes told our class of divinity students and undergraduates the semester that we were with her was arguably from a quieter, less brutal time, but one in which the effects and the legacy of loss and abuse and the slower act of genocide and destruction continued. For Inez Talamentes' class, the stories were of and from the communities that remained, who had survived, but fighting to preserve what was left of language, forbidden as it had been to be taught or spoken, and to resuscitate religious traditions largely outlawed during the long campaign to destroy Native peoples and their culture. Here's a bit of history, yours and mine, that I learned that year. Maybe you all know it, and I missed it in high school. Did you know that U.S. laws were such that Native communities were only allowed to preserve and observe one religious tradition or rite or celebration in a year? How many people knew that? The Mescalero Apache chose the women's initiation rite. This gorgeous celebration where a young woman is cared for and taught, dressed in finery, and fed, and dances all night. One period of extended time attended by the community until eventually she runs up into the mountain and meets and becomes one with and returns forever connected to the goddess Isanaklesh. I love that this was the most important ritual for this community in a war that is still, in many parts of the world, very much at war with women. I loved that the Mescalero Apache chose this ritual and rite to hold above all others, this gorgeous rite of empowerment and honoring of girls, and that they understood it as so powerful, as the one to keep. And it does beg the question, doesn't it? I mean, who in that class I was in could help but wonder what other rituals or rites were lost? Which were forced underground, diminished? Among the Apache, or the 500 federally recognized Native communities and nations that still exist in this portion of the North American landscape. And here's another piece of history, ours. Did you know also that this one religious ritual that the community could keep, just this one, that it had to be celebrated on a fixed date? All of them, all around the country, celebrated on one date. And do you know what that date was? July 4th. That is not a joke. That is not a parody, but it is completely deranged. For me, this history changes things, even just this. It makes July 4th different, for one. It taints it a little, right? It's now also this day, now that I know this other layer of psychological and cultural and religious abuse, of ignorance, of the attempt to destroy the beauty and the power of the religious impulse, of perverted national pride, of the freedom of religion that's part of the story of the founding of this nation, that people came freeing persecution to this place that enshrined freedom of religion, but who persecuted the people it found for just such a desire, for just and in just such a way. Choose your enemies carefully, Forest Church. My minister growing up used to say, choose one of them, John was the other, choose your enemies carefully, for you shall become like them. How often that's true. So reclaiming history and telling the truth, it's messy and it's complicated. And it's sometimes awful business. Except, of course, for those who already knew the truth, because they were on the losing side of it. Richard named some of what that's meant for him. That's ours, too. Truths that date back to the Middle Passage and to today. And we know that there is a wealth of such untold histories of hurt and cruelty and injustice needing to be told. For the people who have held those alone for too long, such moments of truth-telling, if we can imagine, if we have experienced them ourselves, have to be powerful, right? a chance not to live in cognitive dissonance, a chance, perhaps, to heal. Writer and social critic Ta-Nehisi Coates, speaking of this kind of work, said in an interview a couple of years back with Krista Tippett, he said, "We must imagine a new country, a place where citizens are encouraged to see themselves critically and where they're encouraged to see their history critically." He went on to say, "You have to love your country the way you love your friends, the way your spouse loves you, right? The people who love you don't blow smoke up your backside. They don't do that. They tell you the hard truths. And that doesn't mean we all know that they don't love you, just like it doesn't mean that you don't love your country." Coates is right, of course. Patriotism, real patriotism, can't be a demand to lie or even a request. Patriotism, real patriotism, has to be believing that we can tell the truth because we love our country, because we trust ourselves as a nation to stare unblinkingly into our legacy, and trust, too, that we can find a way to name and address and repair the wrong, or try. But also because we know that this will make us stronger. Because when everybody's truths are at the table, we will finally be the United States. Maybe for the first time. And that is a foundation worthy of the best chapters of a country's life. Our future life. The one we can, with complete integrity, hand off to the babes that we bless and send out into this world that we have forged. Crazy Horse of the Oglala Lakota Sioux Nation once said, "A very great vision is needed, and the person who has it must follow it. Follow it as the eagle seeks the deepest blue of the sky." So deepest blue of the sky to us all, and courage and conviction to see with the eagle's perspective our place in the world and where we must go from here. Deepest blue of the skies to us all.